Okay, welcome to Seven Continents, One Story, and I genuinely cannot wait for this one.
Glad to have you with us today. This is going to be a good one.
I've been looking forward to this all week, honestly.
I'm Ethan, 13 Maltese, and way too obsessed with history for someone my age.
I'm Niels, professor of history, originally from Sweden.
And I'm Celine, joining you from Edinburgh, Scotland. I read far too many history books in my spare time.
Every episode, we go deep into a story from one of the seven continents. Ancient stuff, modern stuff, stories that actually change the world.
Stories that deserve to be told properly, not just as a footnote in a textbook.
Because history is full of moments that still echo today if you know where to look.
History just hits different when you know the full story. See you next time.
Right. Celine, Ethan, I have a challenge for you both. I'm holding something that's 2,500 years old, and I bet neither of you can guess what it is just from my description.
2,500 years? That's ancient Rome era, or even earlier. What have you got, Nils?
It's made of marble, perfectly white marble from Mount Pentelicon, about the size of your hand if you spread your fingers wide, and it's covered in the most extraordinary carvings. Warriors, horses, robed figures in perfect detail. The craftsmanship it's breathtaking.
Wait, are these just random carvings? Like, is it a statue, a tablet?
These fragments, and there are many of them scattered across the world now, they once told the story of an entire civilization's pride. They're pieces of the greatest artistic project in Western history.
Oh my goodness, is this what I think it is?
When I held the replica of one of these sculptures in my hands at the British Museum, I actually felt tears. I couldn't help it. These pieces represent a moment when humans decided to build something so beautiful, so perfect, that they believed it would last forever.
But it didn't last forever, did it? If you're just holding fragments...
Exactly, Ethan. That's the story. The rise, the glory, and the fall of the greatest civilization the ancient world had ever known. Let me take you there. The year is 461 before Common Era, the year that changed everything. You're standing in Athens, not the Athens of ruins and tourists you might imagine, but a city alive with possibility. The air smells of marble dust, seawater from the nearby Aegean, and the smoke of thousands of cooking fires. The sun is mercilessly hot. The streets are narrow and crowded, and everywhere, there's energy. The energy of a people who've just defeated the greatest empire on earth and are now asking themselves, what can we build?
461 before Common Era? That's barely a generation after they defeated the Persians, isn't it?
Exactly. The threat is gone, but the question remains. And into that space steps a man named Pericles. Athens in the mid-5th century was at a crossroads. Yes, they'd defeated Persia, but the city was still caught between two competing powers in the Greek world. On one side, Sparta, militaristic, isolationist, ruled by an iron fist. On the other side, Athens, chaotic, democratic, constantly experimenting with how people should live together.
Hold on, I thought Athens invented democracy. That's what we learned in school, but it sounds like they were still figuring it out.
That's actually a brilliant question, Ethan, because the answer is complicated.
Thank you both. Here's the thing. Democracy was invented in Athens, yes, but not all at once. It was built gradually, like a city being constructed piece by piece. Before Pericles, there was Solon, then Cleisthenes, then Ephialtes. Each one pushed the idea further.
So Pericles wasn't like the first Democrat?
No, but he perfected it. He took what his predecessors had started and made it real in a way that changed everything. In 461 before Common Era, Ephialtes, who'd started radical democratic reforms, was assassinated, probably by political enemies who saw their power slipping away.
Murdered because people were afraid of change.
Precisely. And into that power vacuum stepped Pericles. He was young, aristocratic by birth, but radical by conviction. He believed ordinary Athenians, farmers, merchants, laborers, should have the same voice as the wealthy elite. Revolutionary idea. Now, working alongside Pericles in these early years was a brilliant administrator and artist named Phidias. He wasn't a politician, he was an artist, a sculptor, but what he did would define an entire age.
So he wasn't just a talker, he actually implemented policies to make that happen, right? An artist? How does an artist become so influential?
That's the perfect question, Celine. You see, Pericles had this vision. He believed Athens needed to build something so magnificent, so perfect, that the world would understand what Athens stood for. Democracy wasn't just a way of governing. It was a way of being. It meant ordinary people could create beauty, not just wealthy tyrants.
So he hired artists to build stuff, like really impressive stuff?
Exactly. And he put Phidias in charge of the entire project. In 447 before Common Era, they began construction of the greatest temple ever built.
The Parthenon. We're talking about the Parthenon.
The Parthenon. Picture this. A building roughly the size of a modern office building, but every single surface is covered in sculpture. Not crude sculpture, perfect sculpture. Mathematically precise, artistically brilliant. The marble they used came from a quarry called Pentelicon, and it's so white, so pure, that when the sun hits it, it practically glows.
And Phidias designed all that?
He didn't just design it, he supervised every piece. There were hundreds of artisans working under his direction. Sculptors, stonemasons, painters, engineers. And the central sculpture, the one that made Phidias famous throughout the ancient world, was a statue of the goddess Athena, 40 feet tall, made of gold and ivory. It was called the Athene Parthenos, and it became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
40 feet? That's taller than a 4-story building.
And when you walked into that temple, the first thing you saw was this radiant, golden goddess looking down at you. It was meant to inspire awe, and it did.
But we were talking about democracy and ordinary people having power. Why are they building giant statues of goddesses? That seems pretty fancy for a democracy.
Now, Ethan, that question cuts to the heart of the entire paradox of the Golden Age, and that's exactly what we're going to explore today. You see, the Golden Age of Athens is extraordinary for what it accomplished, but it's also profoundly troubling for how it accomplished it. Let me explain. In this era, from 460 to 429 before Common Era, Athens became the intellectual center of the world. It's where Socrates walked the streets, asking questions that would change philosophy forever. He didn't write books, he just questioned, constantly. He'd corner someone in the marketplace and ask, what is courage? What is justice? What is piety? And he'd demolish their assumptions until they admitted they didn't know anything at all.
That sounds kind of annoying, actually. Like, nobody likes being told they're wrong about everything.
But that's the point, isn't it? That method of questioning, we still use it today. It's called the Socratic method.
Exactly right, Celine. Socrates was here in the assembly watching Pericles speak. The 3 great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, were premiering plays that explored the deepest questions of human existence. Every year, there were dramatic festivals where new works competed, and ordinary Athenians sat in the audience judging them.
Wait, ordinary people judge art competitions? Like farmers and merchants were deciding what was good art?
Yes, and here's what amazes me. They were right. The plays they chose, we still perform them today. Sophocles' Oedipus the King, Euripides' Medea, these are the greatest dramatic works in Western literature, and they were chosen by popular vote.
It's almost like democracy made them better, like they had to make something that actually moved people, not just impressed the elite.
That's one interpretation, and it might be true, but here's where it gets darker. The wealth that paid for all this, the Parthenon, the plays, the philosophers, the democracy that paid ordinary citizens to participate in the assembly, that wealth came from somewhere. And it wasn't from honest trade or agriculture, it came from silver mines, specifically the Laurium mines south of Athens.
The Laurium mines. I remember reading about those.
Thousands of enslaved people, nobody knows exactly how many, but estimates range from 10,000 to 30,000 over the years, worked in those mines. We're talking about deep shafts, carved into rock with almost no ventilation. The air was thick with lead dust and toxic fumes. Workers couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. The temperature swung wildly between hot and freezing.
How long could people survive working there?
A few years, if they were lucky. Ancient sources suggest many didn't last more than 3 to 5 years. The conditions were so brutal that when a slave became too weak to work, they were simply abandoned, left to die in the shafts or cast out to fend for themselves.
And Athens called itself civilized. Athens called itself democratic.
And that's the paradox. The same society that invented democracy, that created philosophy and drama, and all the intellectual achievements we celebrate, that same society built its entire economy on slavery, Systematic, brutal, invisible slavery.
But but doesn't that mean democracy doesn't work if they were enslaving people?
That's a profound question, Ethan. And the honest answer is, the Athenian democracy was a democracy for a specific group of people. It excluded slaves, it excluded women, it excluded foreigners. When we talk about democracy in Athens being revolutionary, we have to remember, revolutionary for whom?
I read something fascinating about this. Women, Athenian women, had no legal rights whatsoever. They couldn't own property, couldn't speak in court, couldn't vote, obviously. They were legally the permanent wards of male relatives.
And yet, the plays feature women constantly. Sophocles' Antigone is about a woman defying the state. Euripides' Medea is about a woman who commits infanticide to punish her unfaithful husband. These plays were watched by thousands of Athenians, and nobody seems to have made the connection. How can we create brilliant art about women's agency when we deny women basic rights?
So like they could imagine women being powerful, but in real life they weren't?
Yes, and there's something profound in that gap. The art suggests a part of Athens knew the system was unjust, but knowledge didn't translate into change. Beyond slaves and women were the metics, foreign residents living in Athens. They were often merchants and artisans. Some were very wealthy, but they had no political rights. They paid special taxes, they couldn't own land in Attica, and any legal claim had to be brought through an Athenian male advocate.
It's like permanent outsiders. They lived in Athens but weren't part of Athens.
And then there were the allies in the Delian League. The Athenian Empire, really. Athens had formed this military alliance after defeating Persia, supposedly to protect against future Persian invasion. But over time, it transformed into something else.
Wait, an empire? I thought Athens was a democracy, not an empire.
That's the thing about empires. They don't usually announce themselves. The Delian League started legitimately. City-states paid tribute or contributed ships to maintain a fleet against Persia. But gradually, the tribute became mandatory. When member cities tried to leave the alliance, Athens used military force to bring them back. When island of Naxos tried to withdraw in 469 before Common Era, Athens destroyed their walls and enslaved their population.
They destroyed an entire island that tried to leave their alliance?
Yes, and there was a brilliant economic trick involved. In 454 before Common Era, the League's treasury was moved from the island of Delos to Athens. Officially, it was for safekeeping from Persian attacks, but functionally, it put all that wealth in Athenian hands. We're talking about thousands of talents of silver annually flowing into Athens from all these supposedly voluntary allies.
Wait, and that's the silver that paid for the Parthenon? That's the silver Pericles used to build all these amazing buildings?
That silver came from a tribute that was originally supposed to be voluntary, but became compulsory, from allied cities that wanted to leave but weren't allowed to, from an economic system that made Athens rich while everyone else paid.
So, the glory of Athens, it wasn't really built on Greek democracy. It was built on slavery, on exploitation of allies, on the exclusion of women.
The economic foundation, yes, but here's the complicated part. The intellectual and artistic achievements were real. Socrates was asking genuine questions about justice. Sophocles was writing profound plays about human nature. The architecture really was revolutionary. The democracy, even with all its exclusions, really did give ordinary male citizens a voice in governance.
So it was good and bad at the same time?
That's exactly right, Ethan. History is usually more complicated than we want it to be. We want to celebrate Athens for inventing democracy. But we also have to reckon with what that democracy was built on. We can admire the Parthenon while acknowledging that enslaved miners in Laurium paid for it. Those marble sculptures we talked about at the start, the ones from the Parthenon, they don't just depict gods and goddesses. Some of them show ordinary Athenians, marching in processions, leading sacrifices, serving the state. They're saying something. Look what we've built. Look what we've created. We, the Athenians, are worthy of immortality in marble.
But of course, the people who actually built the marble, the stonemasons, the slaves in the mines, the sculptors, they're not shown. Their names are mostly forgotten.
That's the erasure of power. The powerful get remembered. The powerless vanish. Now, let me take you to a specific moment. 430 before Common Era, you are Pericles. You're at the height of power. You've built the Parthenon. You've implemented jury pay. So poor citizens can participate in government. You've maintained Athenian dominance over the Mediterranean alliance system. But a cloud is forming on the horizon.
What kind of cloud?
Sparta. The Spartans are growing nervous. Athens is too powerful, too confident, too willing to challenge Spartan authority. Tensions escalate over smaller conflicts. Disputes in Corinth, conflicts over who controls which city-states. By 431 before Common Era, Sparta issues an ultimatum: dismantle your empire or face war.
So they basically said, give up power or we fight you.
Exactly. And that's where Pericles makes a decision that will echo through history. The question is, what would you do? You have three realistic options. First, negotiate with Sparta. Give up some of your imperial holdings, reduce tribute from allied cities, become a regional power rather than the dominant Mediterranean force. You'll lose wealth, lose status, but you'll avoid a catastrophic war.
That sounds sensible.
Option 2, build up your defenses. Athens has better ships, better strategy, better generals. You fortify the city, you rely on your navy, and you prepare for a long defensive war. It'll be devastating, but you might win, and if you win, Athens becomes undisputed superpower.
That's the aggressive option, fight to win.
Option 3, seek a middle path. Attempt serious negotiations while preparing for war. Hope to reach a compromise that preserves some of Athens' position without full conflict.
I think I'd negotiate. I know that sounds weak, but listen, war is catastrophic. People die, economies collapse, buildings you've spent decades building get destroyed. The Athenians have already proven themselves great. Doesn't doing that peacefully seem better than fighting?
But that's like admitting defeat without even fighting. If I'd built something amazing, something I believed in, why would I just hand it over to people who wanted to take it from me?
This is exactly what Pericles faced. And here's what makes it interesting. He didn't see it as black and white. Pericles chose the defensive option. He chose war, but not because he was aggressive or foolish. He believed something more important was at stake than just territory or wealth. He believed democracy itself was at stake.
He thought Sparta would destroy democratic government if it won.
Pericles gave a speech to the Athenian assembly, recorded by the historian Thucydides, and he said something that still resonates today. He said Athens was a democracy, for the administration is in the hands of the many and not the few. He said Athens valued freedom of speech, freedom of thought, the right of ordinary citizens to participate in government, and he believed those things were worth fighting for.
That actually sounds noble.
It is noble, and it's also tragic, because what followed was 27 years of war. The Peloponnesian War, they called it. And Athens lost everything. But before we get to that, something else happened. In 430 before Common Era, the year war began, a plague struck Athens. It started in the port city, Piraeus, and spread through the crowded streets of the walled city. It killed about 25% of the Athenian population. We're talking about possibly 100,000 people dying.
100,000? What was it, the Black Death?
Do we know what the plague was?
That's one of history's mysteries. Thucydides describes it: fever, gangrene of extremities, internal bleeding, but we can't definitively say what disease it was. Some historians think typhus, others suggest typhoid or plague itself. What we know is that it devastated Athens at the exact moment they needed to be strongest.
Almost like fate was answering Pericles' decision.
Pericles himself died from the plague. Possibly. The sources disagree. But what's clear is that he didn't live to see the war's outcome. He died in 429 before Common Era, just 2 years into the conflict he'd chosen. Remember Phidias? We mentioned him early on, the artist, the sculptor who supervised the Parthenon. There's something remarkable and tragic about what happened to him.
He's the unsung hero, isn't he?
Phidias directed the most magnificent artistic project in Western history. He coordinated hundreds of artisans. He sculpted the Athena Parthenos, 40 feet of gold and ivory that moved people to tears. And then he was prosecuted and exiled.
Exiled? Why? He created masterpieces.
Because Pericles' enemies wanted to hurt Pericles, and they knew that attacking Phidias would wound him. They charged Phidias with embezzlement, claiming he'd stolen gold meant for Athena's statue. The charges were probably false, but he was convicted anyway. He fled Athens. He died in exile, far from the city whose beauty he'd created.
So the architect of the Golden Age never got to see his masterpiece outlast him.
He died in exile knowing that the Parthenon still stood, but his name was being destroyed back in Athens. History buried him. For thousands of years, people admired the Parthenon without remembering the man who made it possible. Only recently have historians recovered his importance. Only recently have we remembered the name Phidias, the man who created the pinnacle of Western art. Remember the name.
And those marble sculptures, the Parthenon marbles we talked about at the beginning?
They're the fragments of Phidias's vision. Some still stand on the Acropolis in Athens. Others are in the British Museum in London. Lord Elgin removed them in the early 1800s, claiming to be preserving them. Now, there's a great political debate about whether they should be returned to Greece. But here's what's remarkable. Even in fragments, they're breathtaking. Even broken, they testify to what one man's vision could accomplish.
But if they're so broken, how do we know they were so amazing?
Because even the fragments are perfect. The proportions, the detail work, the anatomical knowledge, it's impossible to look at a fragment of a horse from the Parthenon and not see mastery. This wasn't just craft, this was genius.
And yet Phidias died in exile, disgraced, while the beauty he created survived him.
That's the story of the Golden Age, beautiful and tragic at the same time. What Athens created in this 40-year period changed Western civilization. The philosophical tradition, Socrates, his student Plato, Plato's student Aristotle, that lineage of rational inquiry became the foundation for all Western philosophy and eventually science.
We study all three of them, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. I never realized they were like 3 generations of teachers.
And it all started in democratic Athens, where anyone could engage in philosophical dialogue. The democratic experiment created the intellectual freedom that allowed philosophy to flourish.
And the drama, the plays they created, we still perform them. I see productions of Sophocles and Euripides every year in Edinburgh. The same plays that inspired Athenians 2,500 years ago still move audiences today.
And the architecture. The classical orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, they defined beauty for centuries. Renaissance architects studied the Parthenon. Neoclassical buildings across Europe and America are consciously imitating Athenian forms. Governments wanted to associate themselves with Athens's democratic ideals, so they built buildings that looked like the Parthenon.
But we have to keep talking about the slavery and the exclusion, right? I mean, it wasn't actually democratic if most people couldn't vote.
That's absolutely right, Ethan. And that's where modern historians have to be honest. Athenian democracy was a revolutionary achievement, and it was fundamentally limited and unjust. Both things are true.
And yet the principles were there. The idea that ordinary people could participate in government, that was genuinely revolutionary, even if they didn't fully live it.
That's actually profound, Celine. The Athenians imagined something they couldn't yet achieve. They created art about women's power while denying women rights. They wrote philosophy about justice while enslaving thousands. And somehow, across centuries, people took those ideals and tried to make them real.
Like they gave the world a dream even if they didn't live it themselves?
Exactly. The dream proved more important than the reality. And that's why we still study Athens. Not because they were perfect, but because they imagined better and left us the tools to try to build it.
This is interesting because in Asia, in China and Japan specifically, they were developing philosophical systems at almost the same time. Confucius, Laozi, they were asking similar questions about how society should be organized.
Exactly, Ethan. Contemporaneously, in different parts of the world, humans were grappling with the same fundamental questions. How should people live together? What's the nature of virtue? What makes a good society?
But they came up with really different answers. The Chinese philosophers emphasized hierarchy and duty. The Greeks emphasized freedom and debate.
And both systems endured. Both influenced billions of people.
That suggests something important. Maybe there isn't one right answer. Maybe different societies found different ways of organizing themselves that worked for their context. And all we can do is recognize the possibilities. Here's something that still haunts me. We don't know what happened to the last great leaders of Athens when the Peloponnesian War ended. Alcibiades, the brilliant general who defected to Sparta and then came back, he disappeared. No record of his death, no tomb.
Really, a famous general just vanishes?
Vanished into history. We know his name, we know his deeds, but we don't know his end. And that feels somehow appropriate for a civilization whose greatest treasures are now scattered across the world.
The Parthenon sculptures,
Lord Elgin took them to London in the 1800s. Some stayed in Athens. Now there's this argument about who should have them.
The marbles are literally split between London and Athens. The best pieces are in the British Museum. The others are in the Acropolis Museum. Greece has been asking for them back for decades, but the British Museum argues it's preserving them for world heritage.
So even how we remember the Golden Age is complicated, we're still fighting over the artifacts?
Yes, 500 years after they were removed, we're still having the argument, which is fitting, I think. Because the Golden Age itself was about these tensions between freedom and control, between ideals and reality.
So the Golden Age of Athens gave us democracy, even if it was limited. It gave us philosophy and drama and beautiful architecture. It gave us ideals about freedom and citizen participation.
And it was built on slavery and exploitation and the exclusion of women and foreigners. The wealth came from mines where thousands suffered. The democracy only included maybe 30,000 out of several 100,000 people living in Athenian territory.
So it's like, it's both? We celebrate it and criticize it?
That's exactly it, Ethan. We don't have to choose between admiration and criticism. We can do both simultaneously. That's actually more honest. Let me end where we started, with Phidias, the sculptor, the artist, the visionary who created the Parthenon. He was exiled, disgraced, forgotten by his own time, but his work outlasted him by thousands of years. The Parthenon still stands, damaged, modified, but still magnificent, and the ideals it represents, beauty, perfection, human achievement, those still inspire people.
Remember Phidias.
Remember the name. Remember Phidias, the man who created the zenith of Western art, the man whose vision shaped civilization, the man who died in exile, but whose work achieved immortality.
That's kind of beautiful, actually, even though it's sad.
The Golden Age of Athens teaches us that human achievement and human injustice often exist simultaneously, that we can create extraordinary beauty while committing extraordinary wrongs, that ideals matter, even when we fail to live up to them. That's not a comfortable lesson, but it might be the most important one.
And it reminds us that we should keep asking, what are we building and who are we excluding from it?
And remember the people who don't get remembered, like Phidias.
Until our next journey through time, keep history alive.